Hare Krishna. My name is Krishna Kirtidas, and today I'm going to comment in part on a video interview of Hridayananda Das Goswami titled, "We Are Preaching to a World That Does Not Exist Anymore," dated 10th October 2021. That's about 3 weeks ago. For full disclosure here, I am a former disciple of Hridayananda Maharaj. I will say more about that later. But for now, I want to address the most discussed topic in the interview. And that's about whether ISKCON's Indian cultural norms and roots are in fact an impediment to ISKCON's preaching in the West. Hridayananda Maharaj thinks it is, but I think there's a better explanation for ISKCON's lack of progress. So, few things that Maharaj says I want to quote here. He says, quote, "See what Prabhupada said, how should we do this?" And so the problem is that Prabhupada was consciously making practical adjustments for the age he lived in. It is now 50 years later, the world is completely different. So another statement. The world is completely different. So Prabhupada, I think to some extent we have lost Prabhupada's agility. We have lost as a movement. But his ability to adapt, to respond to changing times, I think we've lost to some extent. I mean, obviously not completely. So Prabhupada came at a time when Indian spirituality was gigantic. It was like a huge thing. Prabhupada came at a time when to be a freak. I don't know how you say freak in Russian, but you probably say freak or something like that. And one of the interviewers, Madan Mohan Prabhu, he says chudak. Chudak it was. Hridayananda Maharaj. That was so the Hare Krishnas, because we look so strange, that was a very positive thing. That showed we weren't just capitalists, we weren't just, like mindless middle-class Americans because we were freaky. We were chudaks. But those times are over. And so if ISKCON in the Western world, especially, again, I don't claim to be an expert about Russia, but in the Western world, to some extent, the Hare Krishna movement is preaching to a world that doesn't exist anymore. A world that has not existed for 40 years. Then later on in the interview, he says, Maharaj mentions 3 things he says that we're not supposed to change. One is our philosophy, the second is sadhana, and the third is the institution. Then next he says, now, as far as you know, how do you dress and what kind of food you cook? I mean, those things we adjust. And if you don't adapt, you'll become like, like the word that's always used, we will become a dinosaur. The dinosaur is the example of a creature that was very big and powerful, but was unable to adjust. End quote. Now, in those days, when I was living in the temple, that was a long time ago, in the 80s, 90s, there was, I used to go out on book distribution and Sankirtan in clothes, and I remember my first Sunday feast, they had some Indian dishes, and I really wasn't familiar at all with Indian cuisine, but they had this pizza. This was in Ireland, by the way, where I joined, and I loved the pizza. And I don't, in no small measure did I join because of the food, and some of that food was Western, because I just love pizza. But, but we got it back in those days, when ISKCON was very much into following India, okay? And, even when I went to Chicago and we had, large Indian community, a very supportive Indian community, we got all those things. We weren't like really over pushing Indian culture and so forth like that. And of course, most Indians came, and you regarded people, but according to their position and so forth like that. But these really weren't big problems back then, and I'm always mystified as to why Maharaj thinks it's a big problem now. But what I want to say is that in addition to dress and food and people thinking you're weird, there are other factors that contribute to lack of success in preaching, lack of success in one's own spiritual advancement, internal troubles in your own community, and so forth. And that has nothing to do with dress and food and maybe other cultural trappings of Indian society. And that's just spiritual advancement. So what if the real reason is that you're not as spiritually advanced as you think you are? Is that really far-fetched? So just look at Srila Prabhupada. The effect that Srila Prabhupada on devotees around him was just, amazing. I never met Srila Prabhupada, of course, but devotees who know him talk about it like it was just some really otherworldly experience. And Maharaj, in his own presentation, also described Prabhupada like that he was really not from this. He was really not from this place. He just happened to have a human body. He was a pure devotee, and he's relating to everybody. So, who in ISKCON today is like that? I don't think anybody in ISKCON today has that same degree of spiritual advancement, and not even close to Srila Prabhupada, as it's been described at least by those who personally knew him. So if you don't have such a person like that, and if people are still struggling with their material bodies and their material material conditioning, then why wouldn't that also have an effect on your success in preaching, your stability, and so forth? So in the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, it is said that a Vaishnava, a topmost Vaishnava, is someone who inspires people to chant just by being present among them. Yahara darshane mukhe aisa Krishna nama, tanhara janiha tumi Vaishnava pradana. First class Vaishnava is he whose very presence makes others chant the holy name of Krishna. And as compared to the Vaishnava Tama, you're the Vaishnava Tara, someone who chants the Lord's holy name incessantly. And the Vaishnava, those who, they've chanted the holy name of the Lord at least once purely. Okay, and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in his famous essay on Vaishnava Ninda, makes the point that only those people who've at least once chanted the name purely count as Vaishnavas. Everybody else below them, they're considered Vaishnava Praya. Those who resemble Vaishnavas, those who are trying to become Vaishnavas. They're not chanting the whole, they're chanting the holy name with Shastriya Shraddha. They're not chanting exactly according to the regulative principles. They're chanting offensively. So, what are the chances that the majority of people, if not the vast majority of devotees in ISKCON, are still on this lower level of Vaishnava Praya? And even probably not a few leaders are on these lower levels. I don't say that there aren't any pure Vaishnavas or somebody who has, but certainly that Vaishnava Tama level is, they're in a rare, extremely rare minority, if there are any at all in ISKCON today. So, so now let's, so the implication of that is that if you're not as highly advanced as you think you are, then your preaching efforts are going to be significantly more modest. The results from your efforts are going to be more modest, at the very least. So is Krishna West really an improvement over the status quo ISKCON? Maharaj, he gave some gushing anecdotes, we're doing great, and so forth like that. Well, the plural of anecdote is not data. Just because you have many anecdotes doesn't mean you really, you're giving us something solid to believe that you really are doing better than mainstream ISKCON. We could start with comparing apples to apples, common statistics like book distribution scores. Now, one thing I'm sure is that if Krishna West had a really positive effect on book distribution, then this would be the first statistic that Hridayananda Maharaj would be giving us. He says, look at what Krishna West is doing. We're doing so much better in book distribution than everyone else. And, so why don't we see those scores? Let's see the comparison. What is the mean book distribution level of Krishna West as compared with the mean book distribution level of mainstream ISKCON in America or in the Western countries, and compare those statistics. Let's see what kind of effect is Krishna West really having. So we don't see those kind of statistics. We have anecdotes, and really anecdotes are nice, but it really still falls on the side of propaganda rather than something solid that we can believe in. So another thing to consider is what scientists call confounded variables. Now, what confounded variables are is that if you're in an experiment and say like you have temperature and humidity, and for some reason you can't, in your experiment, you can't control the temperature and the humidity or something like that. But you think that either have something to do with, say for example, in cooking, how your food turns out, and you're doing an experiment. You can't conclude whether the temperature and the humidity had a positive effect, negative effect, or whatnot. It could have been the humidity, it could have been the temperature, and so forth. So in this case, the confounded variables are dress and food versus lack of spiritual advancement. You could make a case for food, dress. I used to do street Sankirtan, and it's a fact that we used to sell a lot more books when we go in plain clothes and not wearing tilak on our foreheads than we did if we went out in dhoti kurta. That's just that's something to experience. But that may not be a very significant reason as compared with lack of spiritual advancement. But because Hridayananda Maharaj's focus is exclusively on the food and dress, implicitly he's just ruled out spiritual advancement. It's like the idea never comes to him or others, he's not the only one, that we're just not as spiritually advanced as we think we are, or as we used to think we are. It just doesn't come. We're just, we're the big devotees, we're the big boys. Well, maybe you're not so big. So another example of confounded variables. Not only has the world changed, yes, Maharaj has observed that, but here's an observation that needs restating. Srila Prabhupada is no longer with us physically. He can't tweak your ear. He can't bring you back on track if you drift off. That's a big thing. His personal presence, enthusing people just by his personal presence. He's Vaishnava Tama. Just by being in his presence, he inspires people to chant Hare Krishna. So this means that Maharaj, he doesn't think that this is a factor. but I think it is. So, does the fact that you're not seeing any results mean you're not advanced? Now, Maharaj in his presentation, he criticizes, some of the movies about Prabhupada, where Prabhupada, he came and he made some followers, and that's kind of like proof that he was doing well. But he raises the point, well, what about in Jhansi? Was he a pure devotee? Was he, he wasn't getting the followers, and he would like to see some more sophisticated, philosophically correct presentation. And I think that's a great idea. I totally agree with him on this point. I think, and we see that here in India too. So when, during Vyasa Puja especially, and, devotees get up and praise Prabhupada, it's like how everybody praises Vivekananda, but, you switch out Prabhupada's name. You switch out Vivekananda's name with Prabhupada, and the kinds of praises you hear of both sound very similar. Of course, there are many very nice Vyasa Puja offerings that go way beyond that, but you do, there is that kind of sense. So it's a good criticism, good idea. But we can also flip that on your head, and he also mentions that, you can have successful people who aren't very Krishna conscious, or not at all. You had your Reverend Sun Myung Moon, you had many others who came, they got a lot of followers, and so why wouldn't that apply with ISKCON? For example, maybe someone, and we especially saw in the early days after Srila Prabhupada's disappearance, that you had some charismatic leader, he was getting lots of devotees, doing lots of preaching, and then he fell down all of a sudden. And so why would Krishna West not be also immune to this? That you're getting some results, but that has more to do with perhaps the charisma, the not so spiritual or kind of the material side of the charisma, with the people leading Krishna West, than it does with the actual spiritual advancement. And I'm not saying that there's no spiritual advancement there, but what I'm saying is that we're not immune. Even after all this, that's not water under the bridge. That's still very much that material reasons might account for success when we really shouldn't be accounting for success even today in ISKCON. So, so one thing I want to say is that, as Maharaj says, that just because you're not getting results doesn't mean that you're not spiritually advanced. Agreed. But then it can also be an indication. So here, Nectar of Instruction 5, last paragraph of the purport, Srila Prabhupada says, quote, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has given some practical hints to the effect that an Uttama Adhikari Vaishnava can be recognized by his ability to convert many fallen souls to Vaishnavism, unquote. So what does that mean? So a closer look at the context of this statement reveals a lot. So here's the last paragraph in his purport to Nectar of Instruction 5. Srila Prabhupada says, quote, in this verse, Srila Rupa Goswami advises the devotee to be intelligent enough to distinguish between the Kanishta Adhikari, Madhyama Adhikari, and Uttama Adhikari. The devotee should also know his own position and should not try to imitate a devotee situated on a higher platform. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has given some practical hints to the effect that an Uttama Adhikari Vaishnava can be recognized by his ability to convert many fallen souls to Vaishnavism. One should not become a spiritual master unless he has attained the platform of Uttama Adhikari. A neophyte Vaishnava or a Vaishnava situated on the intermediate platform can also accept disciples. But such disciples must be on the same platform, and it should be understood that they cannot advance very well toward the ultimate goal of life under his insufficient guidance. Therefore, a disciple should be careful to accept an Uttama Adhikari as a spiritual master. So, here's some points to note. One, Srila Prabhupada doesn't say that a Madhyama or Kanishta Adhikari cannot be Guru and accept disciples. He says that they can, but they shouldn't. And that's because their guidance is deficient in some way. He says insufficient. And their disciples will therefore struggle to make spiritual advancement. Srila Prabhupada also says that. So, Srila Prabhupada's disciples did not automatically become Uttama Adhikaris when Srila Prabhupada passed away and they started initiating. So this is Hridayananda Maharaj's argument, basically, but in a different context. Okay, Prabhupada, just because he was in Jhansi and not getting results, doesn't mean he wasn't a pure devotee then. So in the same way, just because you became spiritual master all of a sudden, doesn't mean you also became Uttamadhikari, instantly. So those devotees were Kanishta and Madhyama Adhikaris. This has been and continues to be the source of so much trouble in ISKCON today. Not the dhoti, sari, khana, food, so forth like that. That's, if it is at all, it's a small thing as compared to having Kanishta and Madhyama Adhikari, senior leaders and spiritual masters, running the show in ISKCON. So Srila Prabhupada says that the guidance of such persons is insufficient. And this alone is enough to account for ISKCON's lack of success in the West and elsewhere. In other words, this is a sufficient cause. You don't need to look for any other cause. This is a sufficient cause. And it certainly accounts for the trouble that ISKCON leaders have landed us in the past. We just have this whole history, and certainly there's a class of leader that would very much like to treat this as water under the bridge. That was then, this is now, we're much better. Well, maybe a little better, but probably not. You're not completely free of it, certainly. So this explains also Srila Prabhupada's law of disciplic succession. That's another controversy going on right now. Should disciples of living spiritual masters be allowed to initiate in their presence? So here's a letter to Tushta Krishna, written by Srila Prabhupada, and it's dated December 2nd, 1975. He says, "Keep trained up very rigidly, and then you are bona fide guru, and you can accept disciples on the same principle. But as a matter of etiquette, it is the custom that during the lifetime of your spiritual master, you bring the prospective disciples to him, and in his absence or disappearance, you can accept disciples without any limitation. This is the law of the disciplic succession. I want to see my disciples become bona fide spiritual master and spread Krishna consciousness very widely. That will make me and Krishna very happy," unquote. So, as I mentioned, some GBC members have been pushing very hard to not follow this anymore, to have their disciples start initiating in their presence. And to justify that, they have produced some quote from Srila Prabhupada that says that there should be hundreds of thousands of bona fide spiritual masters so everyone in society can very easily understand Krishna consciousness. And so because of that, they think that, well, in order to get to that number of hundreds of thousands, you have to stop following this law of etiquette. But Srila Prabhupada in this very statement says, I want to see my disciples become bona fide spiritual master and spread Krishna consciousness very widely. So Prabhupada doesn't think that this law of disciplic succession is an impediment, but some others do. And also further proof that they have given against this is that they've said that, well, there are bona fide devotees who have disciples that have started initiating in their presence. But, this is a very important but here, if gurus are going to be Kanishta and Madhyama Adhikari devotees, people will not easily understand Krishna consciousness from Srila Prabhupada. I mean, if they're going to be Kanishta and Madhyama Adhikari devotees, people are not going to easily understand Krishna consciousness from them. And Srila Prabhupada said that. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada mentioned this law of disciplic succession. If you are not yet an Uttama Adhikari, then why should your guru also make you an Acharya? He shouldn't, because he himself may not be an Uttama Adhikari either. And Srila Prabhupada said that disciples of such gurus must also be on the same level. So, Srila Prabhupada, in this regard, even he himself said that he would choose some disciples to be guru, but that they were not yet ready. Here's a quote from a room conversation. Prabhupada, yes, I shall choose some guru. I shall say, quote, now you become acharya, you become authorized, unquote. I am waiting for that. You all become acharya. I retire completely. But the training must be complete, unquote. This is from a room conversation dated April 22nd, 1977, Bombay. So that's your law of disciplic succession in action. Srila Prabhupada didn't see anyone fit to take over from him. So the Kanishta and Madhyama devotees have to wait their turn. In sadhana bhakti, being an initiated is a requirement. It's not optional. In the absence of an Uttama Adhikari, then Kanishta and Madhyama Adhikaris have to take over and initiate. So some last words on the law of disciplic succession here. Why are senior ISKCON leaders pushing so hard for this? Soon enough, all their disciples will be eligible. So why reject this etiquette? And if we go back to Srila Prabhupada's statement about the law, we see that he thinks it's perfectly compatible with spreading Krishna consciousness very widely. So why is this a problem at all? Some ISKCON leaders are thinking they're more advanced than they actually are. They think that if Srila Prabhupada could choose some gurus, then why can't I just go ahead and do it? You know, I'm in the driver's seat now. But to violate Srila Prabhupada's law of disciplic succession, really you have to be so highly advanced that it doesn't apply to you without you committing an offense. You have to be an Uttama Adhikari Vaishnava. And also you have to be able to recognize that your disciple is also an Uttama Adhikari. But what if you are not really an Uttama Adhikari? Then by violating this law of disciplic succession, you are creating more trouble. Not only for your grand disciples, but for society in general. Srila Prabhupada says that making spirit advancement is troublesome for disciples of Kanishta and Madhyama Adhikaris. And that explains so many things. Trouble in our own society, lack of success in preaching, no need to blame there's no need to blame our food and dress on any of it. Guru Kuli child abuse scandals. And you still think you're Uttama Adhikari. So as America's president, Joe Biden, says, this is his catchphrase. Come on, man. You blew it big time, and not just on that issue. And in some important ways, it's really a miracle that ISKCON is still together. So at least accept personally and collectively that we aren't Uttama Adhikaris. We're just not there yet. We're Kanishta Adhikaris, we're Madhyama Adhikaris, we're making spiritual advance, and it might be slow. Nectar of devotion, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu says, a sadhya bhakta, someone who's made it past the stage of sadhya, is extremely rare. So that means the vast majority of people, that means the vast majority of people in your Vaishnava Sangha are going to be sadhana bhaktas, not sadhya bhaktas. So if you do that much, at least not act like we're uttama adhikaris or think that we're just advanced devotees and we just know how to do stuff, then there are a lot of benefits from that. First of all, modest results become much more tolerable. And because that's what you would expect for your level of advancement. It gives you an incentive to purify yourself and become an actual uttama adhikari. Excel in your service, pray to Srila Prabhupada and Krishna for their mercy. And really, the mercy dimension, Krishna sending Prabhupada, he'd say how his Guru Maharaj was sending him all these disciples, that Krishna's sending him so many people, and Krishna's making the arrangement. Well, that's really what's going on. So if we're not pure Uttama Adhikari Vaishnavas, residents of Goloka Vrindavan, somebody who's actually seen the spiritual world, then why should we expect, Krishna says, Ye yatam mam prapadyante, that as all surrendered to me, I reward them accordingly. I reciprocate with them accordingly. So, that's why we're not seeing this big Hare Krishna explosion like we saw in Prabhupada's day. Yeah, I mean, you can say that, okay, it was a time we were all freaks, it was a freaky time, it was a perfect storm, a confluence of events. But I think that minimizes, that tends to distract us from the role that Krishna himself and the acharyas, purvacharyas, were personally and directly playing in that. If Krishna is in somebody's heart and he's telling him, okay, go to him, surrender, and so forth like that, how is that not, how is that not significant? So bottom line, if you want to see a Hare Krishna explosion again, come up to that Uttama Adhikari level. And if you're not seeing the Hare Krishna explosion, then the chances are pretty good you're not an Uttama Adhikari. You may be Madhyama Adhikari, you may be Kanishta Adhikari. Even if you're Madhyama Adhikari, you're just doing your duty. Prabhupada has set up a institution and you can maintain that. You probably can't set up an institution. I'd say almost certainly you can't set up an institution to rival Srila Prabhupada's if you're a Madhyama Adhikari. You're just not that spiritually adept, spiritually powerful to do such a thing. So, stay within your lane. That's the big thing. Stay within your lane. No more cheap Uttama Adhikaris. And, I remember many years ago, Maharaj, he was, defending the advancement of the leaders, saying Uttama Adhikari means someone who's, going around the world and he's preaching, and making a lot of devotees. Okay. Well, there's more to it than that. Nindadi shunya hridamipsita sangalabdya. Nindadi shunya, that you have to be also, free of envy in your heart. And there are other qualities as well. And so we saw that there are many people who are chanting Hare Krishna. They have a big influence. They're traveling around the world. They're making devotees. But they weren't exactly non-envious. And, and it's not that that's ever gone away. So, no more cheap Uttama Adhikaris. It's a more sober basis for moving forward and making genuine progress to think that, we're actually Madhyama Adhikaris, and the reason for our lack of success is our own personal purity and spiritual advancement. There's Shastra Praman for that. We don't need to beat up food and dress and so forth like that. Alcoholics Anonymous, they say the first step to recovery is to admit you have a problem. So let's admit that the problem is that we're not as spiritually advanced as we may think ourselves to be. Why not go there? You know, at the very least, that's certainly a much more significant problem than food or dress. So this brings us back to Krishna West. Just very briefly, Maharaj, Hridayananda Maharaj, has not established that Indian food and customs are really the cause for the lack of success of preaching in the West. Because as a potential cause, it is confounded with the fact that devotees, in several cases, many cases, tend to overestimate their actual level of advancement. And this actually causes trouble due to their insufficient knowledge, devotion, and guidance. And this, I feel has a lot more power to explain why we don't have a Hare Krishna explosion anymore than Indian food or dress. That's all I want to say for right now. But there are a number of other things that I would like to comment on in some future videos in Maharaj's presentation. Hare Krishna.